About a year and a half ago, Anker SOLIX released their new C1000 power station, and at the time I found the C1000 to be a very solid new entry into a very popular 1000 watt-hour capacity class. And in fact, one of the things I really appreciated about Anker SOLIX's C series of power stations is that rather than repeating the same cookie cutter designs as just about everyone else, Anker SOLIX has differentiated their product lineup with some cool and handy innovations in both the software and the hardware. And today, Anker SOLIX is releasing their first major update to the C1000. This is the new C1000 Gen 2. So let's dive in with the key specs and see what's different in this Gen 2 release as compared to the original C1000, and then we'll put it through the paces and see how it performs. Okay, so starting with power output, the Gen 2 is now rated for a full 2000 watts continuous with a peak surge capacity of 3000 watts, and that's up from 1800 watts and 2400 watts respectively on the original C1000 Gen 1. And both the Gen 1 and Gen 2 have the same rated battery capacity at 1024 watt hours, and on charging inputs, the Gen 2 can fully charge at a max of 1600 watts of AC input in just about 49 minutes, which is about 10 minutes faster than the Gen 1 and just extremely fast in general. And for solar charging, both the Gen 1 and Gen 2 can accept up to 600 watts of solar, but the Gen 2 actually expands the maximum charge current by a couple of amps. That just makes it a little bit easier to max out that full 600 watts with a voltage range between 11 volts up to 60 volts max. Now, like the Gen 1, the Gen 2 still does have a fast sub 10 millisecond UPS mode to keep your important electronics from going down in a power outage, and both have a 5-year warranty. Now, there are a couple of notable differences on the Gen 2, starting with the fact that there is no longer an area light like there was on the Gen 1. And there's also no longer a battery expansion port on the side. In fact, on this new Gen 2, they've actually moved the 12 volt 10 amp car socket that used to be on the front over to where the battery expansion port used to be. And then finally, the Gen 2 weighs in at 24.9 pounds, which somehow is actually about 3 pounds lighter than the Gen 1. Okay, I think that about covers it for the key specs and what's different. So let's go get this guy to the lab and see how it actually performs. All right, we are fully charged. Let me go ahead and unplug this from AC power. And I've got this set to pull 10 amps, 12 volts from the side 12 volt car socket. So as I may have mentioned already, there is a 12 volt car socket on the side on this Gen 2 unit, not on the front like there was on the Generation 1. And the battery expansion port that was on the Generation 1 unit has now been replaced on the side with this 12 volt 10 amp socket. So let me go ahead and turn that on, and I'll zoom in here for you. We're reading 13.35 volts. Let's make sure we can actually run this at 10 amps. And under load, we're pulling, looks like we've dropped a little bit of voltage drop to 11.7 volts. All right, we're going to let this run all the way down until the BMS shuts the discharge off, and then we'll check and see how many watt hours we actually caught out of that rated 1024. Looks like our AC discharge capacity test is done. Let me just check to see where we left off. Yeah, battery empty, 0%, 1%. Okay, so let me zoom in here and let's see how we did. All right, so if you can make that out, 835 watt hours right there in the middle. So that is out of that rated 1024. That is a kind of a down the middle average DC discharge of about 81.5%, almost 82%. So respectable number. So I wouldn't call this a standout number, but it's definitely not a bad number. So pretty average, as I said, on the DC discharge capacity test. All right, we are fully recharged. Let's go ahead and do an AC discharge capacity test through the AC inverter and find out how well we do there. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the AC inverter on, and then let's connect my little meter here. 119 volts, and we are outputting just about 500 watts. So about 25% of the overall capacity of this AC inverter. So let's let this thing run until the BMS shuts us all the way down. We are counting up the watt hours. We'll find out how many watt hours we get through that AC inverter out of that rated 1024. All right, looks like our AC discharge capacity test is done, and we're just flashing at 1%, which I guess is the reserve state of charge for this Gen 2 C1000. Let's connect the watt meter here to grid power and see how we did. All right, 926 watt hours. That's a very good number. That's actually out of that rated 1024 watt hours. So that out of the AC inverter is a usable capacity of right at about 90%, which is actually pretty well above average. So very solid usable capacity numbers through the AC inverter on this C1000 Gen 2. All right, let's do some load testing on this new Gen 2 C1000 with its upgraded 2000 watts of output. So let's first make sure what we're outputting here. We're outputting a total of almost 119 volts exactly, so just a hair under 120 volts. So that's excellent. So let's just keep that up and we're going to monitor that. If I zoom in on the display here, you can see we're currently pulling a total load of about 1600 watts, or just a hair over that. So let me go ahead and get my timer out. And then we're also going to monitor decibels so that we can see how loud this thing actually gets when it's at full load. So let me start taking the load up, and this should get us right to a little bit over 2000 watts. And we're at 2013. So this thing is perfectly silent at the moment. It's a little bit warm in here, but I'm sure the fans will kick on at some point. Let's go ahead and start the timer. All right, so 10 full minutes at max load, and in fact we were actually at just a little over 2050 watts. But you'll notice that after a couple of minutes in, we dropped significantly in the voltage. This is the surge pad voltage throttling feature that this unit has. We dropped down to 102.7 volts. That's a pretty significant drop. And by the way, if we watch the decibel meter during this whole thing, it capped out at just under 62 decibels maximum volume, which is basically where we are right now, if you can hear how it sounds. So it's a pretty neutral white noise. Definitely not a silent operator in the heat. It is pretty hot in this room, pushing upper 80s, almost 90 degrees. I'm curious to see if I reduce the load just a little bit and fall below that 2000 watts, if it will bring the voltage back up. So let's see if that is in fact what happens. Keep our eye on the voltage, or the watts there. Yeah, we dropped down to, now we're 30 watts under that 2000 mark, and we're back to 119 volts. So that 2000 watt output is a hard cap to maintain that 120 volts. And if you exceed 2000 watts, even by a little bit, it will start throttling that voltage on you until it eventually cuts off. So let me go ahead and take this up and find out what it will take to trip this unit. So let me add a couple hundred watts. Keep your eye on the watt meter there. We're at 2,144 watts. And we do see this still at, there we go, now we're starting to drop. And it does seem like the floor on that is 102 volts. And we are at overload. So this will trip once you get above that 2100 watt total load or so. But that's exactly what you want your power station to do. You don't want to push it continually past its rated sustained output, because you're going to risk damaging something or starting a fire. So you want it to shut down like this. So that's exactly how we want this to behave. So that 2000 watt load test on this C1000 Gen 2 is a definite pass. All right, let's do the wake and charge solar test on this C1000 Gen 2. Now the solar connector here is over on the left side, and it's got a couple of input modes here. It's 11 to 28 volts at 8.2 amps, or 28 volts up to 60 volts at 14.5 amps. So it'll take a maximum input of 600 watts. It's currently sitting at 23%, but I have the AC inverter on and I'm pulling 126 watts, which means that something like 3.5 hours or so, this should be fully depleted. And that's exactly what I want to do, because I'm actually trying to simulate a case where maybe you're running a refrigerator overnight, for example. And we've got solar coming in on the side here, but it's actually 7:51 p.m. and we're basically not getting any solar input at all. So I've got a 400 watt panel with a volts open circuit of about 37 volts currently connected. So if this unit will wake and charge automatically, it should start charging itself in the morning, even though it ran itself down and had to shut off. And because I want to also test in that app that output port memory option, I have turned that on in the app. It should remember once it attains a state of charge of 10 or 11%, I'm thinking that this AC inverter should actually turn itself back on, if I understand that feature correctly. So we're going to test two things, find out if this will wake and charge automatically in the morning, and once it gets to a sufficient state of charge, whether or not it will re-enable the AC inverter. So we'll check back in the morning and we'll see how it actually behaves. All right, clearly a rainy, overcast morning, but I think the sun will be coming out maybe a little bit after noon, so we'll check on that power station a little bit later today. All right, the sun has come out and we have some sun on the solar panel. Let's go inside and see what's going on, if anything. All right, we are up to 9%. And we are at 155 watts input, which is just about right given the amount of sun hitting the panel right now. We have passed the wake and charge test. Now, I'm curious to let this charge a little bit longer and see if we get to 10 or 11%, if that output port memory will automatically kick on this AC inverter and begin outputting that approximate 120 watt load. So we'll kind of keep an eye on this and we'll find out. All right, we just clicked over to 11%. I heard the relay come on and we are indeed now outputting 120 watts while inputting 163 watts. So not only does the wake and charge function work now, where I don't believe that was a successful test on the older Gen 1 version, so that is a definite improvement on the Gen 2 C1000, but that output port memory definitely works. Now, why did it come on at 11% instead of 10% state of charge? And that is because the way that the output port memory works is that the state of charge must rise to at least 10% above the discharge cutoff limit. And the default discharge cutoff limit is 1%. So 10% over that gives us 11%. So all these functions work exactly as they are billed. All right, it is 3:47 p.m. We are still pulling in 410 watts. And we are still outputting 125 watts. And as you can see, with this solar input, we have fully recharged the unit while continuing to output 120 to 125 watts all day long. And we're not quite done with sun production since it's 3:48. We probably got another 2 or 3 hours. But yeah, so if you max this thing out or close to it, you can easily still power a 100 watt load all day while fully recharging this C1000. All right, let's find out how much harmonic distortion or noise that we're going to get out of the AC inverter on this C100 Gen 2. So to do that, we're going to use my old guitar amp with no noise suppression or anything on it. So if there's any noise in the line, we should be able to hear that coming through the guitar amp. So I've currently got the guitar amp plugged into grid power, which should be pretty clean. Let me kind of give you a baseline sound test of what this sounds like just on clean grid power. So let me switch the power cord over to the AC inverter on the C1000 and see if it sounds any different. All right, we are switched over now. Let's run the same test and see if we can hear a difference. All right, so much like the Gen 1 C1000, it does have a little bit of a noise in the AC inverter output, which means that it's probably not going to be suitable, at least without a line conditioner, for remote power source applications for PA systems, guitar amps, ham radios, and things like that. So if you did want to use it for that purpose, you would probably want to use a line conditioner, because as a musician, that is a little more noise than I would be comfortable with coming out of a guitar amp. So just something to be aware of. All right, let's do a quick check on the UPS capability on this C1000 Gen 2. And notice it's sitting at 80%. And if I zoom in on that screen for you, you can see that we are inputting 445 watts and we're outputting basically the same amount. So we're passing through power even though we're at 80%. That's because I used that feature in the app that allows you to set the maximum charge and discharge thresholds. In this case, I've set the max charge threshold to 80%. And you can set that between 80 all the way up to 100 if you want. But if you're using this full-time 24/7 as a UPS device, then I think you probably don't want to keep it at 100%. And the fact that the app lets you knock this down to say 90% or 80% like I've got it is very cool, because that means you're not going to be stressing the battery cells out any more than absolutely necessary when this thing is plugged into grid power and passing through power pretty much constantly. All right, so let's quickly simulate a power outage here. And I've got everything coming in the front through the AC inverter, the gaming PC, the monitor, the sound system, all that stuff. And then I've got grid power coming in here through the side. So simulating a power outage in 3, 2, 1. You can see on the screen now we are only outputting power. We're no longer inputting power, and the computer had no issue with that. Let's see if it works in reverse, and we'll switch back over. Heard the relay. No issues with the computer, and we are now balancing input and output power once again. So UPS mode on this C1000 Gen 2 definitely confirmed. Okay, let's wrap up with some final thoughts. So first, I have been seeing a lot more comments lately from people asking me to be a little bit more specific about what kinds of things a particular power station can run and how long it can run them. So rather than just putting a link to my Google spreadsheet in the video description, which is what I typically do, I thought maybe I'd start by doing just a quick walkthrough of that spreadsheet here in real time using the data from this C1000 Gen 2. So let's jump over to the computer and check that out real quick. Okay, so this is the Google spreadsheet, and there's an important note up here, and that is I have this online version locked down, so you can't edit it directly. But what you can do is you can download your own copy of it, and then once you've downloaded your own copy into your own Google account, then you can go and edit it any way that you like. So, but you have to download it first, so just be aware of that. But how it works is you basically enter in the power station's rated battery capacity in watt hours. So for this particular C1000 Gen 2, that number is 1,024 watt hours. And then you enter in the continuous rated AC inverter output. Now the continuous rated inverter output on this unit is 2,000 watts. So once you key that in, then it will open up everything on here and highlight it in green and show you what it's capable of running. And then it'll also show you an estimate of its runtime in hours or number of cycles, depending on what you're talking about. So for example, if I had a power station that's say topped out at 600 watts, well, you notice that a bunch of stuff at the bottom just got red, meaning that that power station will not run those items. I'm going to go back to the 2000 watts. And as you can see, this C1000 will run pretty much everything on this list. So that includes things like a full-size refrigerator, an older style, and that would run a full-size refrigerator, older one, something in the 2010, say 15 years old, for about 8.6 hours. And keep in mind that this is going to vary depending on ambient temperature, your temperature set point, how efficient your fridge is. But that's why I made a differentiation between this older one and then compared to a newer one, so a 2024 model. And I tested mine, and it came out to about 7.4 hours. So surprisingly less efficient in terms of total runtime, because apparently that newer model runs some kind of a defrost mode every 24 hours. So I happen to catch mine during that, and if you have a newer one, yours might do that too. So it will reduce your runtime. So this runtime is basically being calculated on the expected average watt hours consumed of the particular device, and then divided into about 80% of the actual capacity of the power station. But you can see that DC fridges on something like this, a small like camping car fridge, you can get about 41 hours of runtime on this kind of a power station. So I've got CPAP machines on here, LED lights, and you can kind of just go around and just, check on the things that you're interested in running, and then just make a note of how long you can run them. Now keep in mind, this is an estimate based on this one thing running only during that test period. So if you run multiple things, that will obviously impact your runtime. So just be aware of that. All right, so this is the spreadsheet. I put a link to the spreadsheet in the description of every power station video. So all you got to do is go click it, go download your own copy, and then go ahead and edit it however you want. But that's how the spreadsheet works, and I hope you find it helpful. Okay, so I did also test the no-load draw on the AC inverter on this guy to see how much power it consumes just by being turned on. Because if you happen to be running a fairly low power device through the AC inverter for a very long period of time, having an inverter that doesn't consume a lot of power will net you much better runtimes versus an inverter that isn't very efficient. And what I found with the C1000 Gen 2 is that it will lose about 1.3% of its overall charge for every hour that the inverter is running. And that equates to a pretty reasonable 14 watts continuous. And I say reasonable because that's a pretty typical number for a 2000 watt inverter. So to wrap up, I think this Anker SOLIX C1000 Gen 2 definitely does offer some improvements over that original Gen 1. More inverter output power, you get faster charge times, you get more solar charging current, and somehow manages to be about 3 pounds lighter. So how about the cost? Well, there's a little bit of good news there as well. You can actually lock in a price of just $429 on this power station, which is a solidly competitive price, especially for something at this high level of build quality. So what do you guys think? Would this C1000 Gen 2 work for you guys? Let me know down in the comments section below. And if you have any questions about this power station that I didn't already cover in the video, leave those questions down in the comment section as well, and I'll do my best to try and answer those for you. Okay, I think that's a wrap on this video. I hope you found something helpful in it. And if you did, I'd very much appreciate it if you click that like button down below for me, if you think I've earned it. I do appreciate that you spent some of your valuable time with me today, and I hope you'll come back and join me for the next one. Until then, have fun out there.